Good to be here with you, Stephen.
Hi, Michelle.
How are you?
Well, thanks. How are you?
Oh, not bad at all. Not bad at all.
Great. Well, let's kick it off and maybe talk a little bit about background. So, can you tell us a little bit about yours, Michelle, and how you came to found Clearbanc?
Yeah, of course. I was a serial entrepreneur. And before this company, I had raised no venture capital. Um, had done I'd done crazy things in my career. I graduated from engineering, figured out that worldwide supply of sturgeon caviar was down by 95% because the world had overfished the Caspian Sea. This was not what a lot of 20-year-olds were thinking about at the time. But we were crazy enough to move to the east coast of Canada and build a fishery from scratch. That was my first business. That actually worked out really well. Our thesis was right. Chefs couldn't find the product. We had no problem selling it. The issue was we went into a giant recession in 2008, and I found myself selling the world's most unnecessary luxury product in a huge recession. So that was quite a way to start off my career. From there, I ended up building an e-commerce company in Canada that's now public. So I saw e-commerce in the very early days in 2010, an early AI app that we sold to Groupon in 2014. And then I was asked to join the cast of the Canadian version of the Shark Tank television series, or it's called Dragon's Den in Canada and the UK. And I was making this transition for the very first time from being a full-time operator and entrepreneur to an investor. I had never done that before. And so one of the things that most people don't know about the show is that the way that we film that series is that we see 250 pitches in 17 days. And it's my first season, and I remember being like, there's so many e-commerce entrepreneurs on the show. You ask them what they need the capital for, and they all say, I'm here willing to give up 5% of my company for 100 grand. You ask what they need the money for. They're like, I need customer acquisition, so Facebook and Google ads, or I need to go buy my inventory. And I just started thinking on the show, I'm like, wait a second, has this been done all wrong the whole time? It actually doesn't make sense for founders to give up equity and control of their business to do something that should be repeatable and scalable, which is the whole magic of ads. Is, if you inject $1, you get $3 of sales out, or inventory, you buy it and you can mark it up by 3 times and sell it. And so I remember on the show, I proposed this idea that I would give them the same $100,000 that the entrepreneur was looking for, but instead of taking 5% of their business, I would take 5% of their revenue until they paid me back my capital plus 6%. This, wasn't a loan. There was no fixed repayment period or compounding interest, and certainly no personal guarantee. This was truly like an, kind of a rev share to do with ads. I said, the only hitch of my deal is that you have to send me your Facebook ad data because they'll know what I'm looking for because I ran an e-commerce company for 6 years. So that, believe it or not, became the beginning of Clearbanc. And we're almost 6 years in now, but we've become the largest e-commerce investor in the world. We have deployed more than $1 billion into 3,300 different e-commerce companies and completely pioneered this new way that founders should think about funding their business with non-dilutive capital for, expense items that, you shouldn't use venture capital for. So that's been kind of, the story so far. The other really interesting thing about our model that I don't think I ever anticipated is the only way we could do 3,300 deals in a couple of years is by using AI to make our decisions. So, we look at ad data, we look at a ton of different things, we determine what your unit economics are, and then we give you an offer in 20 minutes, which is why it's the 20-minute term sheet. And when we look back at the fabric of our portfolio, it just looks a lot different. I mean, we've backed 8 times more women than the venture capital industry average. We've backed founders in all 50 states in America. It's the same stat internationally. In the UK, 70% of our founders live outside of London. And so for a brand whose mission it is, we really believe that you have a great idea, you should be able to get access to capital, and that shouldn't be reliant on really who your friends and family are and which circle you're from. I think we've been able to do some of that.
Well, quite a story. And in full disclosure, we're an investor in Clearbanc.
Yeah.
We met a couple of years ago, and so we're a big fan of the model. And in fact, one of the reasons why we were a fan of the model is because as early stage investors in Europe and now investors in North America, we saw so many businesses every year that were not a perfect fit for venture capital, but they were running perfectly good businesses, and we had really nobody to send them to.
Totally.
And thankfully now we can send them to you.
That's awesome. Well, look, it's hard to, because we talk so much about venture capital, it's hard to sometimes imagine how big the world is. So just, to put this in a sense of scale, there are 25 million e-commerce businesses in the world, and 5,000 of them got venture funded. So that's just a massive 99% market. But like, Stephen, I would love to hear your story. I would love for you to share your story as well. Like, you didn't come into VC kind of the conventional way. You came in as an operator. And so it would be great for you to share that.
Yeah. I've only been a VC for about 4 years now. I've had 3 careers really. The first was as an engineer in the mobile industry. Second was as
in the oil industry. Did I hear that
in
right?
the mobile industry, mobile industry.
Okay.
Mobile telecoms. Yeah. Second was as an executive at Google and at Twitter, and then more recently at Frontline as a VC. So I guess, right back at the start, I studied engineering. I'm from Ireland originally. I studied engineering in Ireland. Then I got a scholarship to go to the US to grad school when I was 20, moved over there. And then I got interested in mobile phones. This is the late 90s when that was kind of a new enough trend. And I went to work for Nokia, which was becoming the biggest mobile phone company at the time. I was an engineer there. And then over a few years, I noticed as an engineer that the company was kind of going off a cliff. But as an engineer, and I was sort of in a little bit of a tech box, I wasn't exactly sure why that was happening. And that kind of got me interested in the business side of tech. So I ended up deciding that it was time to move out of engineering. And so I ended up moving to Google around the time that Google went public. I was living in the US at the time, and I started running sales and marketing teams there. Moved back to Europe, and the growth just continued to pace. I was at Google for more than 6 years, and then I moved to Twitter in the very early days for Twitter, when Twitter was expanding internationally for the first time and had no revenue outside the US. And so I went as one of Twitter's first employees outside the US, and I ran the Europe, Middle East, and Africa business there for 4.5 years as a private company, as a public company, and then I moved to Frontline, where we invest actually on both sides of the Atlantic. So we've kind of got 2 sides to the business, and what's in common is that we have an interest in the transatlantic move. So we invest in B2B software companies in Europe at an early stage, and then we tend to help them expand to the US. And actually, we do the flip of that too. And that's how you and I got to know each other, where we invest in North American companies, usually at a growth stage, so maybe Series B, C, D, and then we help them expand into Europe. And that's the story.
And so, as you think about, you've seen so many pitches too, like, how do you think about, when founders should be using alternative capital sources versus VC? Like, how would you kind of paint that picture?
Well, I think you talk about positive unit economics, where a lot of the proceeds are going into things like Facebook ads or AdWords or so forth. That's not necessarily the best sort of setup for taking dilutive venture capital. I mean, totally. we invest in Europe at the very early stage. I would say the majority of our investments now in Europe are pre-revenue. So at that stage, there's no unit economics. There may not even be
unit economics. There's no revenue yet.
There may not be any customer, may not be a product yet, and so that's really what VC is designed for. And we take a lot of risk in Europe, and it's never too early for us. In the US, I mean, interestingly, US and in Canada, we invest at growth stage, and I think it's well known that there's an awful lot of capital chasing a relatively small number of really high quality companies there. So by definition, the companies that we talk to don't need our money. I mean, that's just sort of the starting point. So we internally always talk about how the capital has to be the least valuable part of what we offer. Right. And so that's why we developed that European expansion kind of playbook and service, because it can't just be about the capital. It has to be about something else now.
Totally. And that's, I think, how we view capital as well, is that, if you are going to Europe, for example, if you're doing international expansion, that's a fantastic use of venture capital. That's true risk capital. Like, you could enter a country, you could completely fail, and you're going to have to go home with your kind of tail between your legs. Product development and doing things that are really hard is like, that's what risk capital is, because you give up a portion of control, you give up a portion of equity to do that, which is great. A great use of venture capital. I think that the way that we've always viewed the world is, it's not that VC is bad, it's just too dilutive if you're going to do repeatable things, right? And so it doesn't matter if you're an e-commerce company funding, ads and inventory will fund you. It doesn't matter if you're a SaaS company that, is going to get paid on a contract over 2 years. We can pay you for that contract up front, so you can invest your own money that you would have made over that 2 years in marketing and sales development. I think that that's kind of how I would have entrepreneurs, because I think not enough people are realizing, like, we are at peak founder dilution today. Like, you look at all of the recent crop of IPOs, whether it's Snowflake or Peloton or whatever, like, all of those founders owned like 7%, 8%, right? And that's really hard. And those are the true success stories. And so, there is some arguments that, like, companies are just going public a lot later, but I still think, like, for founders, when you're doing the work, it is really important to be retaining ownership and to getting to do that. And so one of my questions for you, Stephen, is around, you've seen a lot of companies trying to expand into Europe. Like, what are the do's? What are the don'ts? I know that, European expansion was a big deal for us this year, and, moving to a couple places internationally. We launched the UK last year. Like, what would you recommend to founders who are, like, very excited about the market, but kind of unsure of what to do and really want to avoid some of the pitfalls you've seen?
Yeah. First of all, maybe to take a step back, first of all, and to talk about kind of different growth levers that let's say a growth stage company might have. The way that we often think about it is that really there are only three common levers that you can pull. Let's say at Series B or something like that. Yeah. One is you can sell the same product to in the same kind of country to a new segment. Like, classic one, you were selling mid-market, you move up to enterprise. Or two, you can sell the same to the same segment, but a new product. So you kind of have to develop a new suite. There's a little bit of product market fit risk again that you have to go through. And then the third one is you can kind of do what you're doing in the US, for example, or Canada, but you just move to international markets. And they're kind of the three most common ones. There's risk associated with all of them. So in that third one, Europe tends to be the first step for B2B companies anyway, just because it's typically, for B2B software company, it's the biggest overall market. At the point of IPO, about 30% of I would say a well-run SaaS company's revenue should come from Europe. Yeah. So that maybe points to the first kind of issue or mistake. I think a lot of, especially US founders, don't realize that the market is as big as that. And so, if, let's say, you're at 300 million in revenue by the time you go public, that's probably about a 90 million business from Europe alone. That's worth investing in by the time you get to Series B or C. The biggest mistakes, I mean, there's a common set, unfortunately. And in fact, this is one of the reasons why we developed this fund, because I had just experienced it myself. I was the head of Europe for Twitter. There were very few people to call. And I found that even the best US investors tended to help with other things, but not that. And so I made a lot of mistakes that I didn't want to make again. And then it turned out that a lot of my peers, had kind of done the same. First thing is timing. Okay. The big question you have to ask yourself as a founder is, when's the right time? Because if you go too late, there can be copycat competitors that have sprung up. If you go too early, which is sometimes a tendency for SaaS companies, because companies with self-serve products where they start getting revenue almost for free.
Open it up, yeah.
Yeah, the danger is there that companies usually before Series B are kind of fairly immature organizationally. The exec team doesn't have enough headspace to allocate to sort of new fires. They've got enough fires at home, and
totally. Don't lose your core market.
That's the thing. I think you need to have a repeatable go-to-market motion in your core home market, let's say in the US, before you're able to really go to Europe. You kind of need to have enough funding as well, and you need to have a big enough exec team. So timing tends to be the big thing. And then there's another, I think, non-obvious one, which is interesting, and we refer to it as success amnesia, where companies 5 or 6 years in to their journey in the US start thinking about international expansion. And when they go overseas, they think of it mostly as a sales effort, where they hire a few sales people and they set a revenue target and tell them to
sell,
go to town. And that's understandable. But actually, if you rewind back to the first 2 or 3 years of the startup's existence in the home market, it wasn't just a sales effort. It was a combination of the founders selling themselves. There was a word of mouth marketing guerrilla effort out on the ground amongst the tech community in the Valley, for example. There was, engineers were talking to customers. Customer success people were feeding back, customer feedback into product. It was a cross-functional thing, and usually there were a couple of there were a couple of guerrilla tactics that really got the company off the ground. And you have to try and find a little bit of that magic again in the new market. And it usually involves more than sales.
So what's the best guerrilla tactics you've seen? That's like, it's such a good way to think about it, because when you're young and you're scrappy and you're 20 people and you're all best friends in a room, it's pretty easy to think of wild ideas and then go execute them the next day, right? I've spent so much of my career in early stage startups. That's very familiar to me, but it's actually just harder. I mean, even like we are 280 people now. It's like there's process and there's rules, and it seems like it's so long. Like what have you seen that's been done that's creative as people have entered Europe?
Sometimes it can be getting some sort of a product advocacy on the ground before you put sales in place. So and it kind of depends on the company, what that role would look like. But whether it's a DevOps person or even an event marketer or some other type of evangelist. It kind of depends on what you sell, but preceding a new market like the UK, or especially somewhere like Germany that might require a little bit more effort, with somebody that's not just selling straight away is a good idea. Also, by the way, and we found in our research that fewer than half of US companies expanding into Europe have a marketer on the ground after the first year. And that's kind of shocking to me, because without some form of marketing in place, it's hard to create the tailwinds necessary for sales to win.
And are people just assuming that their digital ads or their agencies are going to translate, but they haven't actually thought about how to customize something for a market? Is that where people are getting caught?
I think it's more that when they look at the sales team 5 years in the home market, everything looks easy now. They've got a repeatable motion, almost by definition. By the time they get to, let's say, Series C anyway, they've got a repeatable motion where they invest in more account executives or account managers or whatever it is. They'll get a certain amount of dollars out the other end. And so, but what I think CEOs and founders forget is all of the other kind of magic that went into making that happen. So I think it's the difference in brand awareness between the home market and the new market is probably the biggest underlying thing, and you need to invest in that to be able to create the conditions to win, I suppose.
And back to your earlier comment on growth levers, like how, kind of sell more of the same product to a new segment, new products is always very hard to build, international. Like, how do you, when you talk about companies, is there like a, easy, mid, hard, or is it just like you should do all three after kind of the Series B? Like, how do you think about companies ranking those?
Yeah. I don't think there's a fixed 1, 2, 3, but I think the important thing is for founders to be aware that there are at least 3 common ones, and not to rule out any of them. Moving from mid-market up to enterprise is obviously a pretty common one, and it can seem easier than it is because Usually you need to hire different types of salespeople. You need a different type of sales motion. You may need to adjust the product as well.
Yeah.
So that's not straightforward. Developing a new product is never straightforward either. And indeed, moving to international markets isn't easy. It isn't easy, but it's not as hard as some people kind of make it out to be. And in fact, I was talking to Elad Gil a couple of years ago, and he said something interesting, which is that great companies often expand internationally too late out of fear rather than strategy. And I think it's true. Sometimes if there's not a huge amount of international experience in an executive team, people will just procrastinate.
Yeah.
And
right.
Yeah, how have you thought?
It's easy because.
No, go ahead.
Go ahead. No.
Well, maybe talk a little bit about how you've thought about growing Clearbanc's business over the last few years, and what levers you thought you had at your disposal, and where did international expansion come in that?
So I asked the question because it's one that we've had certainly ourselves as we've had to grow up as a company. So, generally we're a Canadian company, and being in Canada really means you kind of sit next to this like giant whale south of the border, and you're always kind of the underdog in the equation. So I actually think it's quite easy for Canadian companies to always think of themselves as international because, and this was especially important in fintech, actually, that we started selling our core product in America. So our product in America worked for almost 2 years, even before we launched our first international market, which was our home market, which was Canada. And I think you can see this in a few of the, you can see this with Israeli companies as well. The home market is so small that, there's this natural push for international markets because you're seeking large enough markets to validate whether these ideas are big enough. And so, even for that, I mean, we got into Canada fairly early on in the game. It was still like a push for us to get into the next market because, as much as the UK was English speaking, but what we did that was really effective is we tried and we ran ads across every country we were thinking of doing, and we just tried to test demand. Our UK launch went incredibly well. Like before we even talked about launching, we had invested, 30 million pounds in 250 companies. And so when we came, it was like, no, we're here. Like, this is not something that we thought of as like a side project. We're taking this very seriously. And then, we hired someone who had done this for 2 other companies previously. And so she had seen what entering Europe was like, what entering Asia was like. And she could give us some of that insight into, this is what we had to do. I think
on that point, sorry to interrupt, but on that point, Michele, we found that the single most important thing that you need to do to get it right is to get your first senior hire right. And we look back at a couple of hundred SaaS companies over the last decade and how they expanded. And in about 50% of cases, they ended up firing their first senior hire in the first 18 months or so. So despite it being the most important thing you can do, most companies or half of companies kind of still get it wrong.
It's, I actually think that's a result of it's just extremely difficult to hire senior talent. I mean, I remember the stat that I was always told is like 50% of executives don't work out. It is so hard to just, first of all, humans are terrible at interviewing. I read this study very early in my career where like Google looks at all of the interview processes they've tried, and like, when they used to interview with the crazy manhole questions and tons of brain teasers and all that, and then they went to the regular interview process and they look at the data over 10 years and they conclude that there was absolutely no difference in who made it at Google and who didn't make it. And I've always kept that in the back of my mind. And there's 2 things that you're fighting when you make an international hire. The first thing is they are not working directly with you the same way. And so there's a time zone gap. And even though we're all remote, it's harder to create, a deep relationship the same way that you could when, we were previously in offices and startups would just spend so much time with one another. But it's just generally hard to hire senior executives. I think that's certainly one of the things. And so getting it right. And I've heard that from so many founders before. Getting it right is just incredibly difficult. And so
it's true. The talent networks thing, like the back channel references, the kind of talent networks that you have, usually in the cities that you've worked in, are a big source of, I think, successful hires. But then you transport yourself to another market 5 time zones or 8 time zones away, and you just probably don't have those local talent networks. You wouldn't even know who to call when you meet someone you think is good.
Totally. It's exactly that. It's so easy on LinkedIn to reference check someone. And it's like, okay, this is a 3rd degree connection in a country that I probably don't speak their primary language. Like it's so much harder to figure out. If you're getting
landing teams also are another way to kind of mitigate the risk a little bit, where hiring a senior executive far away from headquarters is always going to be a little bit risky. But sending over, let's say, 2 high performing, they don't have to be senior, but high performing, kind of tenured employees from head office over to that new headquarters location in London or Amsterdam or Dublin or Berlin or wherever. That can be a really good complement, where you get the seniority and hopefully the strategic view of the senior hire, and also their local network for hiring in Europe. But then you kind of complement that with a couple of people who know the company, who know the culture, who probably know the founders, who know the product. And that can be quite a useful kind of combination. I'm surprised more companies don't do that. I think it's because it's hard to spare 2 great employees in headquarters. But I think it pays off if you're willing to do it.
I love that. I love that technique and idea. And I know that on our team, it has been hard because we're actively in that, where it's like, well, this person wants to international, but they would be leaving a big major project. It's going back to those growth levers that you were talking about. Like, one of the things that always matter to us is, we provide capital for all of these entrepreneurs with incredible ideas. And so the bigger the venture capital ecosystem, you could argue, maybe we're less needed. And when we started in San Francisco, we started in the biggest venture capital ecosystem in the world and found a ton of demand for our product. And so every international market we thought of as, there are just extraordinary entrepreneurs here. And the reality with e-commerce is a lot of these companies are naturally e-commerce, are naturally international based, right? And so you can ship to so many different places. And then I think you asked me earlier about how we think about the other segments. Like, we've certainly kind of done all 3. We've gone deeper international, and that's a big part of our roadmap for this year. We've gone into different segments. So we started with just e-commerce companies, and we offered inventory products to them. Then we went into SaaS companies as well. And now we're starting to think about how do we fund very early stage companies before that unit economics stage that you were talking about, and how to do things kind of even earlier based on our data. But it is really hard to just think about everything that's competing for your attention as a founder and trying to figure out what's working. Those are just generally never easy things.
Yeah. And maybe just to look back over the last year, which has been absolutely extraordinary in every possible way. You've got a good insight because you've got so many customers that are trying to build their own businesses across quite a few industry verticals. Were there any interesting observations that you saw through, the really tough Q1, Q2, and then into Q3, Q4, either related to Clearbanc or your customers' interesting trends you saw?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many. And, people look back and they're like, oh, you backed e-commerce companies, was great year for e-commerce, which it was. But I can tell you, along that roller coaster, it certainly didn't feel like that along the way. I mean, in March and April, our primary concern was that consumer spending was going to dry up everywhere, right? This could have been, the largest recession certainly any of us had seen in our lifetimes, or even larger than that. I don't think anyone anticipated that governments were going to print the volume of capital that they were going to print. I think the stat right now is the US government has printed 2.5 more times more money than they did in 2008. And this is not close to stopping yet. I mean, people are anticipating the US government's going to print another $2 trillion this year. So and consumer behavior just went wacky. I mean, I remember in the first couple of weeks, like children's toys shot through the roof. Everyone has their kids at home and they're like, okay, I'm going to do some form of entertainment or education. And here are the toys for the kids. We saw categories, anything that was close to like events or travel, apparel, beauty, all dropped almost immediately because people are like, I'm going to be at home. I don't need this stuff. But then consumers started getting very bored, and very quickly, those categories actually started to pick up in an incredibly weird way. And so apparel has largely not seen that kind of drop. I mean, even beauty, which it's like, are we going to put on makeup if we're going to do Zoom calls? Well, the reality is you're looking at your own face all day long. And so that category, did very well. And then overall, I don't think any of us that were in e-commerce anticipated we would go from, I mean, depending on whose stats you look at and if they're worldwide or not, but it's kind of, we went from roughly like 13 to 15% of retail sales were e-commerce, all the way up to like 27, 28%. I mean, we were expecting that over the next 10 years. Like, this was totally unprecedented. And then it's good to actually peel back the onion and figure out which categories those were on that were taking us such a long time to break through. So the first big one was food. People were so scared to buy food and groceries online. Like, they were, people like my mother, they were like, okay, well, I don't want to order my groceries online because, my blueberries are going to be crushed by the time they come to my house. And lo and behold, COVID happens and my mother gets her blueberries and they're not crushed. And she's like, why have I been going to the store for all of these years, right? You can truly teach a new segment of consumers a new habit. So food, meal prep, delivery, all of those categories completely blew up and expanded. Next big category was big bulky items. So this is everything: barbecues, furnitures. I mean, it seemed outrageous that you would furnish a home over the internet and spend, I don't know, even more than $10,000. But people renovated their houses over COVID, and $50,000, $100,000 transactions on websites like became common in many cases if you were in kind of that segment, which I don't think anyone was expecting. And then probably always the third category that I laugh at is color cosmetics. This was something that people just always had a hard time with. They're like, well, I'm going to buy the foundation or the eyeshadow and it's not going to match my face, because we used to go into stores and use testers, which is now a bizarre concept to imagine sharing a lipstick tester with another human. So when we're in kind of a world where we're all talking about one virus. So anyway, I think that was probably one of the the unknowns that was not expected from the e-commerce standpoint. I think for me personally, I had always been like deeply devoted to being in the office. And I just thought there were so many magical collisions that happened when people were there late at night or early in the morning and you're brainstorming and you're all in the same room and you can all look at the same whiteboard. Like, there was actually even at Clearbanc before this, there was no ability to work from home. Like, we didn't have a work from home program. I mean, I guess if you wanted to, you could dial in for a day, but like, it was so unusual. And I thought this was going to be just a complete disaster. And,
well, and I remember the first time I was in your Toronto office, everybody was so crammed together. It's almost unimaginable now. I don't think anybody was more than 2 meters apart.
Exactly. I remember
it was electric. I mean, that was
it was electric.
Place was about.
Like, VCs would walk into that office and they'd be like, there's a magic in this place. Like, everyone is moving at the speed of light, but they're all like very helpful, but like we are all going really fast and you could just like feel it. Like, it was like, I always describe like that feeling of landing in New York City where you would just land and you're like, this whole city's on fire. It's electric. Like, that's what the Clearbanc office used to feel like. And it is very hard to recreate that. And mute is actually, I think, one of the worst functions on a video call. And I get why we do it. It's like, but as a leader, you feel like you're talking into the abyss. You're like looking for nods, but like when people can cheer and call things out and make jokes, like, it is so much better. And it's so hard. So, I thought that was going to be impossible. It's not been easy. It's definitely been harder to maintain our closest relationships. It's been harder to make people feel valued because I always call it like the shortest increment of time is now 30 minutes. You can't, like in the office, you could go talk to 12 people in half an hour, right? And you could touch base with all of them and they all remembered that you cared about them, and they all remembered, you knew what each other was doing, and you could help and you could solve problems in real time. And that, I think, has just been a challenge. And it's been one of those things. The only nice part about it is everyone had the challenge at the exact same time. And so even when you fundraise, it was not like you were competing with other people that were going in person and you were going over Zoom. It was just all a part of this.
Yeah. But we've noticed a silver lining to that when it came to how companies expanded internationally, because if you look back to the pre-COVID days, very many early stage North American companies were, I would say, not just US centric in the case of American companies, they were also very HQ centric. And that produced this sort of magical environment that existed at headquarters. But whenever you opened a new office, and it could be, San Francisco headquarters and a New York office, it didn't even have to be London or Dublin or somewhere like that. Whenever you opened a second office, it was very much a satellite of headquarters, because none of the kind of the comms or decision-making processes were set up to happen in anywhere other than through the founders at HQ. And that made international expansion especially hard, because then it went to five time zones or 8 or more. Whereas now, after having 6, 9, 12 months of practicing this sort of distributed working, every company has had to figure out a way to survive and communicate. And maybe it doesn't feel as efficient as it was before, but I think muscle has been built that companies are going to benefit from when hopefully they do go back, at least partially, to the office towards the end of this year, maybe. That muscle will pay off in other areas.
Yeah, one of the things that we think about is we actually got to know our employees. We used to do retreats twice a year, and we'd go to a beautiful farm or a place in nature, and we just spend 3 days together and do brainstorming and learn about and that's where I actually built real relationships with my employees. That's where I started to know more about just, what their children's names were. You actually started to know some of their stories that was so meaningful. And I think that now that one of the things, the huge about it's exactly what you said, is that we have now hired everywhere. I mean, we have data scientists in Richmond, Virginia, and we have folks in San Francisco and folks in New York. And we have, we couldn't even build, more satellite offices because people are so distributed now. But we think about, in a post-COVID world, could we just increase our retreats every 2 months? Could we spend a week together as a company, all in one central location? That gives us the chance to build those bonds, put goals together, and then move back into a distributed place where, you're right, as soon as companies get too big, they have to have that level of distribution anyway. So can we bring some people back together quite a few times a year? And I think it's a really interesting solution to think about. This is all just in my imagination now. Obviously, we haven't executed on this, but I'm excited to do this when we can all get back together.
Yeah, and do you imagine the future of Clearbanc is partially back in offices, fully back in offices, or to take more of the sort of Dropbox approach of having studios that people drop into? Have you kind of thought about what the future looks like there?
I think we're pretty committed to this idea that we should get together as a team 6 times a year in person in a central location. I think beyond that, there will always be an office, and we'll think of it probably like that. If you want to come into the office, I personally loved working in the office. I liked not being close to my home, but I've also gotten used to it. And so I think giving people that option, and we'll have a very different footprint in the future, but it is a really positive one.
Yeah.
Any other predictions from you on the future of work?
Well, what I've noticed, because we specialize in this sort of transatlantic corridor, we've got a good view of how companies are expanding in both directions, and US companies pretty much stopped expanding internationally in the first half of last year, but then after about Labor Day in September, they started planning again for 2021. What I think, so first of all, there's a big pent up demand for it. There are an awful lot of companies that would have expanded in 2020 that'll do it in 2021.
Yeah.
I do think plenty of companies are going to end up making a little bit of a mess of it because they think that distributed working means that they can hire people anywhere.
Right.
And it will turn out that I think that's not really the case. That might be okay in the short term, but in the longer term, you still need to cluster people together, at least in the same kind of countries that you would have before. There are too many disadvantages to having onesie twosies spread all around the continent.
Well, it's a great place to end, and an exciting time for everyone to kind of be expanding in this new world we're living in. This was really fun to do with you, Stephen.
Likewise, great fun. Thanks, Michele.